instance, when I entered evolutionary biology, there was a big conflict between the experimental geneticists on one hand and the naturalists on the other hand. And as a product of my time, of course, I tried very hard to help in bridging that gap and leading to a unification of evolutionary biology. And that I did to a considerable extent, or I contributed to that to a considerable extent in my 1942 book, Systematics and the Origin of Species. Now, I'm a product of my time, if you compare it with previous centuries, for instance, by believing that science is strictly a secular enterprise. Now, Darwin, when he published The Origin of Species in 1859, all of his teachers at Cambridge University were ordained ministers, and everything they believed had to do with God, the creation, and the beautiful design of the world by God, and so forth. And Darwin, of course, had to contribute, or did contribute, to a change from that point of view, and an attempt, which now has been fully accepted by all scientists, to explain everything without reference to creation and God. Now, that is a foundation from which I started without any thinking about it at all. This was taken for granted. On the other hand, I entered my research career at a time when biology as a field had a difficult stand, because the thinking everywhere was dominated by the physical sciences. And for instance, in the 1920s to 1970, a big field developed, the philosophy of science, and it was totally dominated by the physical sciences. There was no attention paid in any of the writings of the leaders in this field to biological phenomena. And I started from that basis, but saw, at least believed, that this was incorrect and that we should have a philosophy of biology which, although accepting the basis that all phenomena in this world are controlled by the laws of physics, but that on top of that, in the field of biology, we had some separate principles and phenomena that just didn't exist in the physical sciences. So there were many things where I was starting from the basis of the thinking of the time, and then tried, in most cases together with many others, to make changes and to achieve advances, and I think we succeeded.
Much of your work has focused not only on understanding the philosophy of science, but also the history of biology. What can we learn from history that will be informative for us in the future?
Well, from history we can learn many things, but of course, for me, the history of a field is the development of the basic concepts of a field. And in that respect, naturally, biology, and in particular evolutionary biology, differs very greatly from the physical sciences. The basic concepts of biology simply are something very different from the basic concepts of physics. And what we learn from it is, for instance, to give a very simple example, there's been a great argument among students of ethics, ethicists, from way back from the Greek philosophers on, as to what is the source of ethics, what is the source of moral principles. And there, biology and evolutionary biology finally has made a major advance. When Darwin published The Origin of Species, natural selection was the mechanism that he discovered and pointed out and promoted. And it was said at the time, well, how can we have ethics when natural selection only rewards selfishness, and there is a complete conflict and opposition between that selfishness which is promoted by natural selection and any ethical principle. Therefore, how could we possibly ever have developed ethical principles? Well, evolutionary biology showed that not only the individual is the target of natural selection, but also the social group. And in the primitive human societies, the hominid societies, the small troops of hunter-gatherers were social units which as whole were either successful or not, either had abundant reproduction and expanded or became extinct. And that depended to a great deal on, not on selfishness, but right the opposite, on altruism. In the social groups, in these little groups of hunter-gatherers, and the same is true for all species of animals that live in social groups, a cooperation among the members, in other words, altruism, cooperation, all that, helped the survival of the group, and of course at the same time also helped the survival of the member of the group who is altruistic and is helpful and cooperative. So that now, just to make this one example, the study of biological phenomena, in this case evolution, has led to a considerable clarification of our thinking about ethics and the origin of ethics.
Oh, so you know, it was car horn.
When the horn blew, we think,
Yes,
you know.
okay.
Kind of hard.
Yes, we're having some traffic noise outside. So,
It was about right before we got into altruism, just about right after the Darwin intro.
okay, so what I may ask is about altruism. I may get you to repeat a little bit of your comments about altruism so that we can make sure we get that.
If I only remembered always what I said before.
It doesn't need to be verbatim.
One of the interesting ideas that you've written about is altruism. How was altruism a riddle that had to be solved?
Well, altruism at first sight would seem to be in total conflict with the concept of natural selection, because natural selection, as it is usually interpreted, means anything that an individual does.
I'm going to stop you right here because we have some more crying noise. And I'm wondering, no. Mhm, okay.
Yeah.
And the horns will be really loud. Yes, what I'm going to do,
Okay, I think it's just the horns and the sirens.
I'm going to start you on altruism again. This time, just repeat the question in case that they have to cut it because of the sounds. One of the interesting concepts that you thought about and wrote about is altruism.
Altruism is, and was for many years, a very puzzling concept, seemingly in complete conflict and opposition to natural selection, because in natural selection it was always said the individual is favored who does everything for his or her personal advantage. But altruism is something, a behavior in which you favor other individuals, help them, even make sacrifices of your own, to your own disadvantage in favor of other individuals.
Okay, good.
I'm waiting because there was noise.
Mhm.
I don't.
Yeah, I'll do a hand signal.
you know,
I can hide most of it.
I don't think you want to do that. Just wait for Joe. You just keep talking and don't worry about the sound unless we.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, I
He
can
makes this
hide a
little
good portion
sound
of it.
that's like this. And if Joe signals,
Yeah,
I
I'll
will just point toward him so you know that we're having a sound problem and you can decide, you can come to a conclusion on that sentence. Okay? Okay,
And the question arose, how can one reconcile the origin of ethical principles and moral feelings at the same time with a belief in natural selection. And the answer was that not only the individual is the target of natural selection, but also the small social group. And the early hominids, our ancestors, lived just like primitive natives in many areas of the world, even today. They lived in small social groups of hunter-gatherers, and they depended very much on cooperation on the members of these groups, and those that were most cooperative and most unified, most cohesive, most harmonious, were the ones that were most successful and increased in size and eventually broke up into two groups, and the altruistic principles that they had spread from generation to generation, because the individual, which even when it made sacrifices, benefited from the success of the group to which the individual belonged, and in that way natural selection actually favored altruistic principles. And that explanation was long missed by the philosophers. They saw this conflict and could not understand how it could be solved. But in the last generation or so, in the last 25 or 30 years, it has become perfectly clear that this is the way it is going. And then we have looked back at Darwin's writings, and we found that in his Descent of Man in 1871, Darwin already had expressed the same idea and spelled it out rather clearly. That was the, of course, you should have made arrangements with the police department to stop all traffic on the street.
And then the horns would have been very loud. You've been talking about cooperation and altruism and evolution, but you were a great cooperator when it came to forming scientific, bringing together different groups of scientists that could work on common concepts. Can you talk about the formation of the new synthesis?
Yes.
The question was about...
Should I answer it now?
Yes, the cooperation and the formation of the new synthesis.
Well, this is a very difficult and little explored field. We have people, and we had this, for instance, in evolutionary biology, who are generally nice people and all that, but totally selfish. They only do things that are good for them. And we have other people who are willing to serve as secretaries and editors in societies, are willing to do all sorts of things for other people, and enjoy it and feel that they are really making as much of a contribution to science as if they were writing another paper. Well, I happen to be in that category. And ever since I entered the scientific life, I've always cooperated with others. I have initiated new groupings. I have become editor of various journals. I even founded one, the journal Evolution, and I became the editor of various journals, and I even founded one, the journal Evolution, and enjoyed this. And looking back at my life, I'm as proud of these cooperative enterprises as I am of my own personal individual publications. So that I think there is a reward in it, but there are people who don't do any of that. For instance, my very good friend Dobzhansky, the famous evolutionist, and
Joe, are you stopping? Are you stopping for this?
No, I wasn't stopping.
Paul,
that.
let Joe.
Let me do the signals. Yeah,
I think it's going to be so
I can hide
disjointed.
most of that
Yeah.
noise.
Let
Don't
him
worry
make
about
that
stopping
call.
unless
He
it's
said,
in my
I think
hands.
it's good, he may want to finish the thought if we deem it necessary. Let Joe make the call because he can really hear it. And
Yeah, I can
make a
stop a lot of the
determination.
noise.
We'll be stopping for anything, I'm afraid. It will be,
should I go on? Dobzhansky and the paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson never accepted an appointment as a treasurer or secretary or editor. They only were willing to accept appointment as presidents of societies. And I think those kind of people have the same right to live as those who are cooperative, but science as an enterprise, as a whole, certainly would not flourish if we didn't have people who are willing to make sacrifices by working, for instance, in the AIBS. That is a very important enterprise, and the people who are presidents and secretaries and whatnot sacrifice a great deal of their personal time working for this, the common good of the biological sciences.
You are an optimist, I believe, when it comes to science. You've spoken very optimistically about the next 50 years of science as the age of the protein. Can you tell us what that means?
Well, to begin with, I've always been an optimist. In fact, I couldn't have lived if I hadn't been such an optimist. When I was a young man, I had the most incredible self-confidence when I went to New Guinea as a 23-year-old young man who had never been to the tropics, never been on an expedition. I did one thing after the other that now in retrospect I find almost incredible that I had the nerve to do that. But with my optimism that I had at that time, I didn't see the difficulties that I really had to face. Now when it comes to thinking about the future, I always am in a dilemma because I see the realities of this life. I see the
Sirens in the background this time. I can't hide those.
You were talking about optimism and your travels in New Guinea.
Well, I would go from that to looking at the field of biology as a whole. And there are certain areas that are most promising at any one given time. And we have just passed through an era that began in 1944, or thereabouts, with the discovery by Avery that nucleic acids are the genetic material, and then by Watson Crick, who worked out the exact structure of DNA, which gave rise to all the other developments in molecular biology that we have experienced in the last 40 years or so. But my feeling is that all the exciting things that are connected with DNA and the other nucleic acids, they have pretty much just been discovered. And we have reached a point now where we have to go on to what the DNA controls or informs, and that are the proteins. For instance, there are genes now known that tell the developing egg which has to be the front end of the developing egg, or the developing embryo, or the developing organism, what has to be the rear end, what has to be the ventral side, and what has to be the back side. But that is just a message they're given, and then that message has to be implemented and orchestrated by proteins. And proteins are very complex three-dimensional structures. And how the proteins, what they do in order to form a front end of a developing organism, we haven't got the foggiest notion. And yet, of course, that's something we very much want to know. And I would say that this kind of thing, the looking at the proteins that are being specified by the nucleic acids, and then see how these three-dimensional molecules, what they do and how they then fit together with other similar molecules, that is going to be a major field in the future.
Much of your discussions have been on problems and problem solving in science. I think of the species problem and other titles that you've used in your work. Why is problem solving such an important part of the scientific process to you?
Well, you see, you have to go right back to the idea, what is science all about? And science really is the endeavor to better understand the world, to better understand nature. And when we look at nature, immediately questions arise in our mind. let us say if you are a cosmologist and you see the different galaxies and all that, then you wonder, where did it all start? And the problem is, what was the beginning of it all? And they finally developed the theory of the Big Bang. You see, now there is a case. Now, of course, the next question, which nobody dares to touch with a 10-foot pole, is what was the beginning of the Big Bang and what was there before? But that's a problem that seems to be quite impossible to solve at this moment. But for instance, when we look at the world and we can see that a species, now go back to biology, a species changes from generation to generation, and the fossil record, if we have a good fossil record, we can see the actual change of a species into a new species. But that still leaves open the problem, how do new species originate? Because we have a great multiplicity of species. We occasionally have big extinctions where much of the fauna and flora is exterminated, and then the gap is filled in again by multiple new species. So the problem is, how does a new species originate? Or more specifically, how is the multiplication of species produced? The change in a column of a species can be explained, but how do multiple species develop? That's a typical problem, and that has been argued about for the longest time, and Darwin tried to solve it and was not successful. But then in the so-called evolutionary synthesis, the solution was proposed and is now got rather generally adopted. And the solution is, in a way, quite simple, which is that every species is not a simple type, but a species is a series of populations spread out in geography, and speciation occurs when a rather isolated part of such a species becomes totally isolated, and then in this isolation changes genetically like all populations do all the time, and then the changes in this isolated population reach finally to the degree, the point, the level that when it comes together again after the breakdown of the isolation with the parental species or with sister species, they do not interbreed anymore, which shows that this isolated population during that period of isolation had become a different species. Now here was the problem, and here is the solution of the problem. And so it is in all through science. We suddenly see something that puzzles us, and we ask a question, and we have some ideas about it, then we test these ideas, and finally a theory is formed and confirmed, and the problem is solved.
What are the remaining interesting questions in evolutionary biology?
Practically any detail requires far more study, far more conjecture of possible solutions, and far more testing. Now the question is, we might ask two different kind of questions. The first one would be, do you think all the basic ideas of evolution that have been developed from Darwin on are essentially correct, or all the recent criticisms that have appeared in the literature, are they valid, and we may have to revise everything that we now believe? That's the first question. And the second one deals with details. Now let me go to that first question. And there I have the firm belief that the basic theory that we now have, and that, curiously enough, Darwin already had correctly developed, is correct and will not have to be changed. And that basic idea is that evolution happens because there is a constant production of variation within every species, between higher categories, and some of them are more successful than others, and they are giving rise to new developments, and that is the process of evolution. In other words, evolution is variation and selection. And selection is the mechanism by which the new things develop, because there is a choice of all sorts of possibilities, and only one or the other one of those is successful. It gives rise to the next generation, which again develops a great deal of variability, and again, only some of them are successful and give rise to the next generation.
On a more personal level, you have just received a Distinguished Service Award from AIBS that celebrates your career. But in that address, you talked about two fundamentally different kinds of scientists and the way that they formed. What kind of scientist are you, and what's the early influences on your work?
I think we should correct the word scientist. I was talking about biologists. There are two kinds of biologists, those that were young naturalists from the birth on. Darwin said, I was born a naturalist, and that was quite correct, and I could say the same for myself. I was born a naturalist. In my earliest youth, I was very fortunate. My parents, both of whom were very much interested in the outdoors and natural history, took me out every Sunday, and we went one Sunday to a limestone quarry and studied ammonites and other fossils, and the next Sunday we went to a heron colony and watched the herons flying in and feeding their young, and another Sunday we went mushroom collecting. My mother knew every mushroom in the woods, not only the poisonous ones and the edible ones, but also the ones that needed one or the other. So that I was, and then I had an older brother who started me bird watching, and after a while I was a very passionate bird watcher. So I was completely familiar with nature from the very earliest time on, and this is true for most of the young naturalists. But then we have another type of biologists, particularly in modern times, and they have come into biology from, let's say, a field like chemistry. And through chemistry and through biochemistry, they finally have become very prominent in working out the problems in molecular biology, and in the field of physiology, the chemical and physical-chemical processes are prominent and require a expertise which the average person does not have, but somebody trained in chemistry and physics does have. Now, I, for instance, don't have it. I couldn't work in that field. So that we have these two kinds of biologists in a way, and for a long time they were sort of fighting each other. And the naturalists said to these biochemists, oh, well, you don't know anything about life. You just deal with organic substances and analyze those, and that's not life. And they in turn said, oh, well, you just talk about big organisms, but you don't explain anything at all. You just, and that phase has been overcome now. And for instance, even in museums where they describe new species or classify species, they use biochemical methods and DNA analysis and all that sort of thing. So these two branches of biology have sort of fused together, and we now have a much more unified biology than we ever had before.